Hi, today's lesson is from section 1.3, Freshwater Flows Underground. Let's take a moment and review what we learned about the water cycle. The process labeled in A is evaporation. After evaporation, as temperatures cool, we have condensation, which forms clouds. Those clouds get pushed by the wind over the land, and then we have the process of precipitation, when water in those clouds gets heavy and falls from the atmosphere. After precipitation, there are a couple places water can go. It could become surface runoff, where it stays along the surface and runs into creeks, rivers, streams that eventually lead down to the ocean. Or we could move down here to groundwater infiltration, where the water becomes part of our groundwater. That groundwater can also become groundwater discharge, which can also go into the ocean. So what is groundwater? Groundwater is water that seeps down into soil and fills in the spaces, or pores, between soil particles. We'll define the word pores in just a minute. Did you know that in the U.S. alone, groundwater supplies 1/5 of our fresh water needs? That's 20%. 20% of our fresh water comes from groundwater. A couple terms that need to be defined before we understand water in the ground are porosity. Porosity deals with the percentage of open space in a given volume of rock. Good porous rocks have spaces that are the same size and particles, and they're permeable. So what does permeable mean? Permeable is something that allows water to flow through it. Permeability increases with grain size, and grain size refers to the grains, the particles that make up that particular kind of rock. You learned in your Aquifer lab that different rocks are made of different kinds of grains. Large grain materials have large pore spaces. For example, sand. Impermeable is a material that water cannot pass through. In terms of rocks, things like clay and shale are impermeable. They hold water instead of allowing water to flow through it. These are very fine-grained rocks. Let's talk now about the regions of groundwater. First is the water table. This is the upper surface of the saturation zone. See the next slide for a diagram of where to find the water table. The topography of the water table usually parallels the contour of the land. When we talk about the water table, there's also something called a perched water table. Take a look here at this drawing. We have the main water table is all the way down here. Underneath that main water table, there would be impermeable rock to keep the water in place. A perched water table is when you have a layer of impermeable rock that runs in between the porous rock or the permeable rock, and then you end up with water that kind of sits in those divots. An aquifer is an underground layer of permeable rock or sediment that contains water. You have to have a layer of impermeable rock below that to keep the water in place. To refill your aquifers, you must have some sort of precipitation. So the more rain and snow you have throughout a season, the more likely it is that your water table will not run dry. Aquifers can be extremely large, and they are a huge source of fresh water for homes. They can also be very deep, or they can be very shallow. It's important when you talk about aquifers to conserve groundwater, because groundwater is a principal source of irrigation. Waste from industry, fertilizers, pesticides, salt from the oceans, all pollute our groundwater. So how do we conserve it? Well, you can conserve groundwater by discouraging the excess use of water from the water table and recycling used water. Another thing to consider are wells and springs. A well is a hole dug into the water table that fills up from precipitation, and then you pump the water to the surface in order to use it. Some of you probably have a well in your backyard or somewhere in your yard that supplies water to your home. A spring is a little bit different. This is also a flow of water from the ground where the land dips below the water table and you don't have to pump it. This water comes up to the surface naturally. So take a look here. Here we have a well. Here is the saturated zone. This line represents the water table. It's the upper limit of the saturated rock. This rock down here at the bottom is impermeable rock, and everything above that appears to be permeable rock. So the saturated zone is the permeable rock that is filled with water. This well has been dug down into the saturated zone, and you pump the water up to the surface in order to use it. However, here, this pond dips down below the saturated zone or the water table, and so the water comes up naturally and forms a pond. An artesian well is also a little different. This is a well in which water spouts out of an aquifer due to pressure from surrounding land and water. So it actually forms a spray that sprays up into the atmosphere or into the surface. A hot spring is another form of water. This is heated water from below the Earth's surface that rises up to the surface. It's heated because somewhere in there it's close to some magma that's underneath the surface, which heats up the water. And finally, a geyser is a hot spring that periodically erupts. It's similar to an artesian well, but a geyser is hot water and an artesian well would be cold water. So what impact do aquifers have on our water? Well, first, aquifers act like a giant filter to clean the water as it trickles down through the soil and rock. Let's take a look at that. Here's a demonstration of how aquifers clean water. All 3 containers will get filled with water. Some of them will drip through very slowly. Some of them will drip through very quickly. And the slower it goes through the layers of sand and soil, the cleaner the water becomes. You can notice here, through this type of soil, the water goes very quickly and doesn't really become any less blue. If you look closely here, you can see the water filtering fairly slowly, but it's very clear when it comes out on the other side. And here you can barely tell that there's any water moving through there at all. So that gives you an idea of how slowly it takes an aquifer to clean the water that we use in our homes. Another thing to remember about aquifers is that they store water for humans to use later. So they hold the water underneath the ground, they filter out bacteria and pollution, so they're essentially holding clean water. And then we can go either dig wells or find artesian wells or springs and utilize the water from there. One more quick review of aquifers. Hope that jogged your memory about what an aquifer is. And if you have any questions, make sure you contact me.